A little girl accidentally finds a secret room in her house. At first, she thinks it's just a game, but when she decides to open the door, everything changes. Inside was something that had been hidden for decades, and her life will never be the same again. Subscribe and write where you're watching this video from. The house had stood for decades, a quiet witness to the passing of generations, and for the little girl who now called it home, it seemed as vast and mysterious as a castle. It was a tall, weathered structure, built of darkened brick and heavy beams that carried the scent of time within them. Each window bore the marks of age, with faint lines in the glass as though the years themselves had etched their stories there. The front door was a solid thing of oak, its handle cool and weighty, and every time it creaked open it sounded like a voice whispering a secret. In the evenings, when the light was dim and shadows stretched long across the hallway, the house seemed to breathe, as though it carried a soul hidden deep within its walls. The little girl was 6 years old, curious in a way that only children could be, and though she was small, she had an imagination large enough to fill every corridor and corner of her world. Her skin was a rich dark brown, her hair a soft crown of curls that bounced when she skipped through the rooms, and her eyes were wide with the kind of wonder that saw not just what was there, but what could be. To her, the house was not merely a place to sleep and eat. It was a labyrinth of possibility, a place where adventures might spring from anywhere if she just looked closely enough. Her parents lived there too, both of them busy with the steady rhythm of work and daily responsibilities. They loved her deeply and showed it in all the ways they could, but their time was often consumed by the ordinary burdens of adulthood. Her mother moved through the house with quiet purpose, and her father often came home late, tired but still smiling when his daughter ran to greet him. Then there was her grandmother, the steady heart of the home, who told stories in the evenings when the light softened and the scent of supper hung in the air. Grandmother's voice carried the weight of memory, and whenever she spoke of the past, the house seemed to lean in and listen with them. The house had belonged to the girl's grandfather once, a man she had never met but whose presence lingered in every room. Her grandmother often spoke of him, of how he loved to work with his hands, how he had filled the house with small touches of his own making. He had been the sort of man who built shelves where none were needed, carved little designs into the wooden banisters, and tucked away hidden compartments in old pieces of furniture. His spirit was the spirit of a tinkerer, a dreamer who found joy in shaping the space around him. Though he was gone now, his memory was stitched into the walls themselves, and his absence seemed to make the house even more alive. The little girl loved to wander alone when no one was watching, her small footsteps padding over the wooden floors. The boards often answered back with groans and squeaks, as though each plank had its own mood. She traced the wallpaper with her fingers, fascinated by the places where it curled away from the wall, and she peered into cupboards that smelled of cedar and dust. The attic above was a place she both feared and longed to explore, for she imagined it filled with shadows that could hide treasures as easily as ghosts. The basement, too, seemed to hum with secrets, a cool place where the light of day could never quite reach. Every corner of the house seemed to invite her questions. Why did the staircase curve so sharply at the second floor? Why was there a faint mark on the ceiling above the kitchen, like the trace of smoke from long ago? Why did some walls sound hollow when she tapped them, while others rang solid? These were the mysteries she carried with her, puzzles she longed to solve even if no one else seemed to notice. Her grandmother would laugh softly when the girl asked about these things, saying only that old houses always had their secrets. But to the child, that was no answer at all. It was an invitation. At night, lying in her small bed, she would sometimes hear sounds that stirred her imagination even more. The wind brushed against the windows with a mournful sigh, the trees outside tapped gently on the glass, and once in a while a soft knocking seemed to come from within the walls themselves. It might have been nothing more than the settling of the house, the wood shifting as it always did, but to her it was something else entirely. She imagined there were hidden places within those walls, passageways or rooms long forgotten, where treasures might be waiting in the dark. The thought filled her with excitement rather than fear, for she was too young yet to believe in the kind of dangers that lurk unseen. To her, the unknown was not threatening, it was magical. Her grandmother sometimes told stories at bedtime about her grandfather's boyhood. She said he had been a dreamer, too, always sneaking away to build forts out of branches, always drawing maps of imaginary worlds. He had a love for hidden places, for secret corners, and though her grandmother never said it outright, the girl began to suspect that the house itself might hold something of him still. Perhaps he had left a mark somewhere for her to find, a whisper of his spirit waiting for someone curious enough to notice. The days passed in a quiet rhythm. Morning light streamed through the kitchen windows as her mother prepared breakfast, and the girl would sit at the table kicking her legs beneath the chair, already plotting which part of the house she would explore next. Afternoons were filled with the hum of distant traffic, the calls of birds in the trees, and the occasional laughter of children from the street outside. Yet, even amidst these ordinary sounds, the house seemed to carry a silence of its own, a silence that promised more than it revealed. The girl began to notice things others ignored. A draft that slipped in not from the window, but from the edge of a wall. A nail in the floorboard that seemed newer than the others, as though someone had replaced it. A set of faint scratches on the inside of a closet, low to the ground, as though a child had once hidden there and marked the wood with idle hands. These were her clues, small but insistent, and though she did not know it yet, they were guiding her towards something greater. She loved the afternoons when the sun was low and the light slanted through the hallways, painting the walls in amber. In that light, the imperfections of the house seemed sharper, more alive. Dust motes floated in the beams of light like tiny stars, and she would follow them as though they could lead her somewhere new. It was in those quiet hours, when her parents were distracted and her grandmother napped in the parlor, that she felt the most free to wander, to press her ear against the walls, to trace her fingers over every seam and crack. The house was no ordinary house to her. It was a place where time overlapped, where the past had not quite let go, and the present was still being written. She felt a strange kinship with it, as though it were watching her, waiting for her to uncover what it held inside. Though she could not have explained it, she sensed that her presence there mattered, that she was meant to be in this particular house and not another. Something called to her from its depths, a voice that was not a sound but a feeling, a tug at her heart that urged her to look closer, to keep searching. And so she did. Day after day she explored, never tiring of her quest. Each discovery, no matter how small, filled her with joy. A loose brick in the garden wall became a mystery. An old key with no lock to match it became a treasure. The hollow thud of one wall compared to the solid ring of another became a secret code only she could hear. The house, with all its quirks and peculiarities, was her playground, her stage, her puzzle to solve. And though she did not yet know what lay ahead, she could feel the story of her life bending toward something extraordinary, something hidden just beyond her reach, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. That moment was not far away. It would come quietly, disguised as another ordinary day, yet it would change everything. For soon, the little girl would discover that one of the walls in her own bedroom was not what it seemed. The adventure she dreamed of was already waiting for her, just beyond her fingertips. The days had begun to blur into one another in the way that childhood often does, a stream of hours filled with little rituals and games, with laughter and quiet moments of thought. For the little girl, each day still held the possibility of wonder, because the house always seemed to offer her something new. Yet nothing prepared her for the moment when her wandering eyes and curious hands stumbled upon the first true sign that the mysteries she dreamed of were not just in her imagination, but hidden right there, in her own room. It was an afternoon like so many others. The light slanted low through the windows, spilling golden beams across the floorboards of her bedroom. She had been playing on the rug with her toys, arranging them in neat rows as though preparing them for some grand parade, when her gaze wandered to the wall near her bed. She had seen that wall 1,000 times, pressed her back against it when she read books, leaned on it when she whispered secrets to herself in the quiet hours of night. Yet now, for reasons she could not explain, something about it caught her attention. She crawled closer, abandoning her toys, and pressed her palms flat against the wallpaper. The paper was faded, patterned with little flowers whose outlines had long since softened, and in one spot near the corner it seemed to lift away from the wall just slightly. She tugged at the edge with a small finger and felt it give. A ripple ran through her, a sensation both thrilling and strange, as though she were peeling back the first layer of a secret. Behind the peeling paper, she found not the smooth surface of plaster she expected, but a faint line, narrow and straight, running down the wall. It was no crack, for the edges were too clean. It looked almost like the seam of something meant to be hidden. Her breath caught in her throat. For all her imaginings about hidden doors and hollow walls, here at last was proof that something unusual was real. She sat back on her heels, staring at the line with wide eyes. Her heart beat quickly, pounding in her small chest, and for a moment she felt uncertain. She was only a child after all, and part of her wondered if she ought to call for her grandmother or her mother. But another, stronger part of her insisted that this discovery was hers alone. It was as though the house itself had whispered to her, choosing her to uncover what lay beyond. Leaning in again, she traced the seam with her fingertip, following it upward until it disappeared beneath the wallpaper, then downward until it faded behind the baseboard. She knocked lightly with her knuckles, and to her astonishment the sound that came back was not the solid thud of a wall, but something softer, hollower, as if there were empty space behind it. She tried again, tapping in different spots, and each time the sound told her the same thing. There was something on the other side. A shiver ran through her, not of fear, but of anticipation. Her imagination surged with possibilities. Perhaps it was a secret room filled with toys forgotten by some other child long ago. Perhaps it was a hidden passageway that led to another part of the house, or even outside. Perhaps there was treasure, the kind she had seen in storybooks, chests of gold coins, strings of pearls, mysterious maps with red X's marking the spot. Her mind raced, weaving fantasies that made her small hands tremble with excitement. She pressed along the seam again, searching for something more, and that was when she noticed it. A tiny bump beneath the wallpaper, almost too small to see, like the head of a nail or the edge of a latch. She pushed at it gently. At first, nothing happened, but then, just as she shifted her weight, she felt it move beneath her finger. A soft click echoed inside the wall, so faint she might have imagined it, yet the panel seemed to shiver in response. She gasped, stumbling back. The wall was not just hollow. It was hiding something that could be opened. Her eyes darted to the door of her room, half expecting her grandmother to walk in and catch her at it. But the house was quiet, the air still, the only sound her own breathing. This was her secret moment, and she knew she must keep it. Gathering her courage, she leaned forward again and pressed harder on the small bump. Another click sounded, clearer this time, and the seam widened by the tiniest fraction. It was not much, just enough for her to see that the wall had shifted. She could hardly believe it. A hidden door was there in her own bedroom, one she had never noticed, though she had lived in this room all her life. Her hands shook as she tugged lightly, but the panel was heavy and did not give easily. It seemed to resist her, as though it had been built to stay closed for years, maybe decades. She braced herself against the floor and pulled again, straining with all the strength her small body could muster. The panel creaked faintly, groaning like something long asleep and reluctant to wake. For a moment, she thought she would not manage it, and the sense of frustration rose in her chest. But then the panel shifted just a little more, enough that she could see the shadow of darkness behind it. She pressed her face close, peering through the narrow gap, and saw nothing but black. The sight both terrified and thrilled her. The darkness was so complete it seemed to swallow the light from her room, a mouth opening into some hidden space. She sat back again, breathing hard. Her pulse was racing, her cheeks flushed with heat, her eyes bright. She knew without doubt that she had found something extraordinary, something meant to stay hidden, but revealed now because she had been curious enough to look. The seam, the hollow sound, the hidden latch, all of it was real. The stories she told herself about the house being full of secrets had been more than just dreams. She did not dare try to open it further that day. The discovery itself was enough to leave her trembling with wonder. She returned to her toys, though she could hardly concentrate on them, her mind replaying the click of the latch and the groan of the shifting panel again and again. The wall seemed different now, as though it were alive and waiting, and she glanced at it constantly, as if afraid it might vanish and leave her to doubt her own senses. When evening fell and her mother came to tuck her into bed, the girl lay still beneath her blanket, pretending to drift into sleep, but her thoughts were far away. She imagined what lay beyond the wall. She imagined stepping into a secret room filled with dust and forgotten treasures. She imagined finding notes from another child, or perhaps from her grandfather himself, tucked away for someone just like her to discover. Every possibility filled her with a new wave of excitement, so much so that she could hardly close her eyes. The wall seemed to call to her in the quiet hours of the night. As the house settled around her, groaning softly with the movement of old wood, she listened for another click, another sound of shifting, but there was nothing more. It was waiting for her, and she for it. Morning came, and with it the ordinary bustle of the household. Yet the girl's eyes returned again and again to that corner, to the seam that no one else seemed to notice. It was her secret now, her discovery, and she guarded it with all the fierce pride of a child who knows she has found something no one else has. She tapped the wall once more when no one was looking, and the hollow sound came back to her like an answer. She smiled to herself, a secret smile, and felt her heart swell. The house had given her a gift, a glimpse of something hidden, and she would not rest until she uncovered it fully. She was only at the beginning of her adventure, but already she knew her world had changed. And so, As she played and listened and dreamed in the days that followed, the little girl waited for the moment when she would be brave enough to push the panel open wide and step into whatever lay beyond. The discovery of the hidden seam in the wall did not leave the little girl's mind for even a moment. She thought about it when she awoke in the morning, when she ate her meals at the kitchen table, when she played outside in the yard, and when she lay in bed at night, staring at the ceiling while the house creaked and sighed around her. That narrow line in the wallpaper had become the center of her world. She could not forget the faint click she had heard when her finger pressed against the hidden bump, nor the soft groan of the panel shifting ever so slightly under her touch. It was no longer enough to know that something was there. She had to see what lay behind it. Days passed before she found the courage. She wanted to be sure no one would interrupt her, and she waited for the right moment when her grandmother would be napping and her mother too occupied with chores to notice her absence. At last, one golden afternoon, when the air in her room felt heavy with stillness and possibility, she returned to the wall with determination in her small face. The seam seemed to look back at her like a secret eye waiting to be opened. She pressed again on the hidden bump beneath the wallpaper. This time the click was louder, and with both hands she pulled at the edge where the paper had curled away. The panel resisted at first, but with all her strength she managed to shift it wider. A thin line of darkness appeared, cool air seeping through to brush against her cheek. The sensation sent a shiver racing down her spine. She pushed harder and the gap widened just enough for her to slip her fingers through. The wood was rough, splintered in places, but she did not hesitate. With a grunt, she tugged until the panel gave way far enough that she could squeeze her small body into the opening. On the other side was a corridor, narrow and black, the kind of darkness that seemed alive. It smelled of old wood and damp stone, a mingling of dust and time that told her no one had stepped there for many years. She hesitated at the threshold, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it might give her away to the whole house. She could hear the faint murmur of her mother's voice downstairs and the distant rattle of dishes being washed, ordinary sounds that seemed to belong to another world entirely. Here, before her, was something extraordinary. She fetched her little flashlight, the one she used at night to read under her blanket when she was supposed to be asleep, and switched it on. The narrow beam cut into the blackness, revealing wooden beams and walls lined with dust. The floorboards creaked as though they were waking from a long slumber. Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside, the panel closing behind her with a muffled thud. The sound sealed her in, and the familiar brightness of her bedroom disappeared as though it had never been. The corridor was tight, so much so that she had to turn sideways at certain points to squeeze through. Her hands brushed against the rough walls, leaving trails in the dust. Cobwebs clung to her hair and clothes, and she brushed them away with little gasps of distaste, but each step forward only made her more determined. The beam of her flashlight wavered, catching glimpses of long-forgotten nails in the wood, tiny scraps of paper or fabric lodged in cracks, and once even what looked like the imprint of a small hand pressed into the dust long ago. She imagined another child walking this same path, maybe even her grandfather when he was young, and the thought filled her with a strange sense of companionship. The silence was thick. Every sound she made echoed back to her in soft whispers, the tap of her shoes on the wood, the brushing of her hand against the wall, the quick rhythm of her breathing. Now and then, she thought she heard something else, a faint drip of water somewhere far away, or the distant rustle of the house itself shifting above her. The air grew cooler as she moved forward, carrying with it a scent of earth as though the corridor were sinking deeper into the ground. It felt endless, a hidden artery running through the heart of the house. She had no idea where it might lead, yet she felt sure it had a purpose. Houses did not simply hold corridors like this without reason. She paused at one point to look behind her, the narrow line of the entrance swallowed now in darkness, and for a moment she wondered if she should turn back. The fear flickered in her chest, the thought that she might get lost, that the panel might close and never open again. But the pull of curiosity was stronger, louder than fear, and it urged her forward. The further she went, the more she noticed how carefully the corridor had been built. The boards fit together too neatly for it to be an accident, and the narrowness seemed designed not to be discovered easily. It was a passage meant to stay hidden, meant for secrets. That thought filled her with awe. She had dreamed so often of treasure maps and secret doors, and now she was living the kind of story she had only read about in books. She gripped her flashlight tighter and pressed on, each step a promise that she was closer to discovering something important. At last, after what felt like a very long time, the corridor bent slightly and widened just enough for her to stand more comfortably. Ahead, the beam of her light caught on something pale, a faint reflection where there should have been none. She quickened her pace, her heart hammering with excitement until she reached the end. There in front of her was another wall, but this one was different. It was smoother, cleaner, and as she pressed her hand against it, she felt it echo hollowly beneath her touch. She tapped gently, and the sound came back deep and empty, a sign that there was space on the other side. She ran her hand along the surface, her breath quickening as she realized she was standing at the threshold of something even greater. The corridor was not the end. It was the beginning, a secret path that led to somewhere new. She stepped back, lifting her flashlight higher to examine the wall more closely. In the faint light, she thought she saw a mark scratched into the wood, a faint X etched by a hand many years before. Her mind raced with possibilities. Had someone left it there as a sign? Was it an accident? Or was it a message, waiting all this time for her to find it? Her heart swelled with the certainty that she was close to something extraordinary. The corridor had led her here for a reason. Beyond this wall, she felt, lay the true secret of the house, the treasure hidden away by someone who had once loved it as much as she did. She reached out, pressing her palm flat against the wood, and whispered softly to herself that she would find a way through. In that moment, standing alone in the narrow passage, she felt braver than she ever had before. The darkness no longer frightened her. Instead, it seemed to embrace her, to guide her forward. She knew that whatever lay beyond the hollow wall, it was meant for her to discover. And so she turned off her flashlight to save its battery, leaned back against the boards, and let the silence of the hidden corridor settle around her. She was no longer just a child playing at adventure. She was a seeker, standing on the edge of revelation, and soon, very soon, the house would give up its secret. The wall at the end of the narrow passage seemed to breathe with her touch, as though it were aware of her presence. The girl stood with her small hand pressed against the hollow surface, her heart racing in her chest, and she knew that she was standing on the edge of something greater than she had ever imagined. For days she had dreamed of hidden doors and secret places, and now, with the dust of the corridor clinging to her clothes and the faint smell of old wood filling her nose, she was certain that she was about to uncover the heart of the mystery. The panel behind her bedroom had led her here, step by step, through the tight and shadowed passageway, and now it had delivered her to this point, to the wall that concealed something on the other side. She leaned her weight into it, pressing harder, and once again heard that faint groan of wood shifting against wood. She tugged at the seams with her fingers, her nails scraping at the rough edges until at last the wall yielded. A section of it gave way with a sigh, opening just enough for her to slip her body through. She squeezed into the darkness, her flashlight beam cutting through the air and revealing a space that made her breath catch in wonder. It was a room, small and secret, hidden so perfectly that no one would ever guess it existed from outside. The ceiling was low, the walls paneled in wood that bore the scars of age, and the air was thick with dust, undisturbed for years. Yet the space was unmistakably a room, a place built for someone to enter and to keep things hidden from the world. The beam of her flashlight roamed across the floor, catching glimpses of objects long forgotten. There was a rug, faded and frayed, its colors muted into shades of brown. Cobwebs stretched across the corners like fine lace, and the faint outlines of old shelves stood against one wall. The girl's eyes widened as she stepped inside, every sense alert. It felt as though she had crossed into another time, as though this place had been preserved in silence, waiting for her to arrive. Her heart swelled with a mixture of pride and awe. This was not just an empty cavity behind the walls, it was a hidden world of its own, a secret chamber. She wondered who had created it and why, and the thought filled her with even more excitement. She moved the flashlight slowly, savoring each discovery. On one wall, she saw faded photographs tacked haphazardly, their corners curling and their images nearly lost to time. Some showed children with smiling faces, though the details were too blurred to tell who they were. Others seemed to capture ordinary scenes: a tree in full bloom, a dog sitting proudly, a woman in a long dress gazing off into the distance. The photographs whispered of lives once lived, of moments cherished enough to be pinned to this secret wall, yet long since abandoned to dust. Her gaze shifted lower, and she noticed scraps of paper scattered near the baseboard, some folded, some torn. She picked one up carefully, brushing away the grit with her fingers. It was yellowed and brittle, the words written faintly in pencil. The handwriting was uneven, the kind that might belong to a child. She could not make out all the letters, but she recognized the effort behind them, the attempt to preserve thoughts on paper. It thrilled her to imagine another child once sitting in this very spot, scribbling out words and tacking pictures to the walls. And then she saw it. In the center of the room, beneath a thin blanket of dust, was a small chest. It was not large, only wide enough for her to lift if she tried, but it was sturdy, its corners bound in tarnished metal, its surface scarred with scratches and dents. Cobwebs clung to its edges, and for a moment it looked like something out of a fairy tale, the kind of box that might hold gold coins or jewels. The girl's heart leapt at the sight, and she stepped forward with trembling hands. She knelt before the chest, the floor creaking faintly beneath her knees, and brushed the dust away from its surface. Her fingertips tingled with excitement as she traced the rough lines of the wood. There was no lock, only a simple latch, rusted with age but still intact. She reached for it, hesitated, then drew back slightly, savoring the moment. For as long as she had dreamed of treasure, this was the first time she had truly stood on the edge of finding one. The air in the room seemed to grow thicker, charged with anticipation. She could hear her own breathing echo in her ears, loud and shallow. Slowly, she lifted the latch, the metal squealing in protest. She paused, then pulled the lid open with both hands. The hinges groaned, and the chest revealed its contents. What lay inside was not the glittering hoard of a pirate's chest, but something far more extraordinary in its own way. The box was filled with objects of many kinds, small toys worn from use, a collection of coins that shone faintly in her flashlight, bits of jewelry that seemed more sentimental than valuable, and bundles of paper tied with string. At first, disappointment flickered in her chest, for she had hoped for gleaming riches. But as she lifted each item, her disappointment gave way to curiosity and joy. The toys were simple, but each carried the weight of memory. There was a little wooden figure, carved by hand, its edges smoothed by years of being held. A cloth doll, its seams frayin, looked up at her with faded button eyes. She found a set of marbles in a pouch, their glassy surfaces catching the light in colors that made her gasp. The coins were old, their faces worn, but they glimmered faintly, promising stories of the hands that had carried them. Most intriguing of all were the bundles of paper. She untied one carefully, unfolding the sheets with reverence. They were filled with drawings, childlike sketches of houses, trees, animals, and faces. Some were colored faintly with crayons, their lines shaky but full of life. She smiled as she held them, imagining the child who had sat here, perhaps by the glow of a lantern, pouring their imagination onto paper. At the bottom of the chest lay a notebook, its cover battered, its pages yellowed but intact. She picked it up with trembling hands, knowing instinctively that this was something important. Flipping through the pages, she found them filled with writing, short stories, lists of dreams, small confessions scrawled in uneven letters. There were doodles in the margins, little maps with X's marked on them, fanciful designs for castles and ships. It was as though she were peering into the mind of someone very much like herself, someone who had once needed a place to dream and had found it here, in this hidden room. The girl sat cross-legged on the floor, the chest open before her, her flashlight balanced on the lid, and she read and read. Time seemed to slip away as she lost herself in the words of a child from long ago. She laughed at the silly drawings, felt her heart ache at the confessions of loneliness, and marveled at the dreams that seemed so close to her own. Though she could not yet understand the full weight of what she had found, she knew that this was no ordinary treasure. This was the treasure of memory, of childhood preserved in secret, waiting for another child to discover it. The room around her seemed to hum with life as she explored. She placed the notebook gently back into the chest and leaned against the wall, staring at the photographs, the papers, the toys scattered across the floor. This place was not empty. It was filled with echoes of laughter and whispers of dreams. It was a sanctuary, a space carved out of the house not for wealth, but for imagination. She felt an overwhelming sense of belonging, as though she had been invited into a circle of children who had come before her, each leaving behind a piece of themselves for her to find. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing deeply of the dusty air. She knew she could not stay here forever, not yet, but she also knew she would return. The hidden room was hers now, just as it had been someone else's long ago. It was her secret, her treasure, and her heart swelled with the knowledge that she had discovered it by her own courage and curiosity. When she finally crawled back through the opening into the corridor, she felt changed. The narrow passage no longer frightened her, for it had delivered her to something wonderful. She closed the panel carefully behind her, sealing the room away once more, and returned to her bedroom with dust in her hair and a secret in her heart. As she lay in bed that night, staring at the wall that hid the doorway, she smiled to herself. She knew that behind that ordinary wall lay an extraordinary world, and she was its keeper. The hidden room had revealed itself to her, and though she could not yet guess its full significance, she sensed that it was only the beginning. Something deeper stirred in her, a connection she could not yet name, a thread that tied her to the past. And though she drifted to sleep with dreams of treasure, she would soon learn that what she had uncovered was far more than a chest of toys and papers. It was the echo of her own family, waiting to be heard. The secret room lingered in her thoughts long after she had slipped back through the narrow corridor into the familiarity of her bedroom. Everything around her seemed different now, as though the discovery had shifted her world. The toys on her rug looked smaller, less important compared to the treasures hidden on the other side of the wall. Even her bed, her books, and the sunlight falling across the floor felt somehow ordinary, shadows of a world that could never rival the hidden chamber she had found. She lay awake at night, her eyes fixed on the place where the panel concealed the passage, her mind filled with the smell of dust, the whisper of cobwebs, and the chest that waited patiently for her return. The next day, as soon as the opportunity came, she slipped back into the secret space. Her flashlight quivered in her hand, the beam cutting through the familiar darkness of the corridor, and when she entered the hidden room, it felt like stepping into another world again, as though time had frozen there and kept its secrets intact. The chest sat exactly as she had left it, its lid heavy and slightly open, the dust still swirling faintly in the air from her last visit. She knelt before it with reverence, like someone standing before an altar, and pushed the lid wide until it creaked against its hinges. Inside lay the same collection of objects that had captured her imagination before, yet now they seemed to call to her even more strongly. She reached for the marbles first, tipping the little pouch into her palm. They rolled across her skin, cool and smooth, catching the light in glimmers of green, blue, and amber. She held them close to the flashlight beam, watching how the colors danced within, as though tiny worlds had been trapped inside each sphere. It was easy to imagine a child playing with them long ago, dropping them one by one across the wooden floor, inventing games and competitions, filling this hidden room with the sound of laughter. She set them gently aside and lifted the wooden figurine. It was carved crudely, but there was something endearing in its simplicity. A small human form with no face, but with arms outstretched as though in greeting. The edges were rounded, smooth, worn by years of handling. She could almost feel the warmth of the hands that had held it before, the invisible fingerprints of time pressed into the wood. For a moment, she hugged it to her chest, imagining it had once been cherished by another child who had hidden away here, just as she did now. Next, she examined the doll, its fabric faded and torn, the stitching coming loose at the seams. Its button eyes were cracked, one hanging by a thread, yet the doll still seemed to gaze up at her with a quiet kind of loyalty. She ran her finger along its worn dress, and in her heart she felt a pang of tenderness. It was easy to believe that someone had once whispered secrets to this doll, clutching it for comfort when the world felt too big. She placed it carefully beside the wooden figure, lining them up like companions reunited after many years. Then she returned to the bundle of papers, tied loosely with string. She untied the knot, her fingers trembling with anticipation, and unfolded the pages one by one. The drawings filled her with delight. Some were simple sketches of houses with crooked chimneys, stick-figure families smiling under the sun, trees with apples hanging like red jewels. Others were more ambitious, castles rising tall with banners flying from their towers, ships with sails billowing across seas drawn in wavering blue crayon. She laughed softly as she turned each page, marveling at how the imagination of another child had been preserved here like pressed flowers between the pages of a book. And then there was the notebook, heavier than the loose sheets, its cover frayed but still sturdy. She opened it with care, and the first page revealed writing, untidy but determined, letters leaning awkwardly across the paper. The words were simple, but they sang with the honesty of a child's voice. She read about dreams of becoming an explorer, of traveling to faraway places, of finding treasure hidden in caves and on distant islands. She read small confessions, moments of loneliness, wishes for friends, fears whispered to the page because there was no one else to hear them. She read lists of favorite things, foods, games, animals, all written with the same eager hand. Each page she turned deepened the sense that she was not alone in the room. The writer, whoever they had been, seemed to sit beside her, sharing their world through the faded pencil lines. She imagined a boy or a girl huddled in the same spot years ago, scribbling in the half-light, pouring their heart into the book while the rest of the house went about its ordinary life unaware. The thought made her shiver with a mixture of joy and sadness. This child had left behind a piece of themselves, and she was now the one to find it. She lingered over the notebook for a long time, tracing the words with her finger, as though touching them could bring her closer to the one who had written them. She wondered if it might have been her grandfather, the man her grandmother spoke of with such warmth, the man who had once filled this house with his inventions and handiwork. Could he have been the child who built this secret room, who stored away these treasures? The idea filled her with awe. It seemed impossible, yet also perfectly right. Her eyes returned to the chest, and she noticed something she had missed before. At the very bottom, beneath the papers and toys, lay a small tin box, no larger than her two hands put together. It was plain, with a lid that squeaked when she pried it open, and inside were coins of different shapes and colors. Some were dull with age, their engravings worn smooth, while others gleamed faintly in the flashlight's beam. They were not gold, not pirate treasure, but they were beautiful in their own way. She held them up one by one, marveling at their weight, wondering where they had come from and who had carried them before they were placed here. By the time she had explored every item, the girl felt overwhelmed. The chest was not filled with riches in the way she had once imagined, but what it held was far more valuable. It was filled with memory. Every toy, every coin, every drawing and note was a fragment of a life once lived, a child's world preserved against time. It was as though the hidden room had been waiting for her, guarding these small pieces of history until she was ready to find them. She closed the notebook at last and placed it back carefully into the chest. Her hands lingered on the lid as she lowered it, her mind buzzing with thoughts. She knew she would return again and again to read and explore, but in that moment she felt a deep sense of respect for what she had uncovered. She was not just playing at adventure anymore. She was holding the past in her hands, carrying it forward into her own life. When she finally left the room, crawling back through the corridor and sealing the panel behind her, she carried the weight of the discovery inside her. Her bedroom looked the same as always, but to her eyes it had changed. The toys on her rug no longer seemed just toys. They were companions to the treasures she had found. The books on her shelf were echoes of the stories told in the notebook. Even the walls, once plain and unremarkable, now seemed alive with the promise of secrets. That night, as she drifted to sleep, she imagined the child who had left the chest. She pictured them sitting where she had sat, their head bent over the notebook, their fingers smudged with pencil, their heart pouring onto the page. She imagined them closing the chest one final time, tucking it away in the hidden room, and leaving it for someone like her to discover. And, in her dreams, she felt them smile at her across the years, as though they had been waiting all this time for her to come. The chest of memory had given her more than treasure. It had given her a connection, a thread tying her to a past she had never known, a bond that would only grow stronger as she uncovered more of its secrets. She did not yet realize it, but the notebook she cradled in her thoughts was about to lead her to a revelation far deeper than she could have imagined. The notebook haunted her thoughts even more than the chest itself. Though the marbles glimmered and the coins shone with their dull, time-worn faces, it was the notebook that seemed to thrum with life. She thought of it constantly, replaying in her mind the words she had read in her secret visits, the uneven letters drawn across the pages with such determined care. The voice that spoke from those pages felt close, as if it whispered not from the past but from right beside her. Every time she opened it, she felt as though the air shifted, as though she were no longer alone in the hidden room. One afternoon, she sat cross-legged on the dusty rug inside the chamber, the chest pushed open and the notebook resting on her lap. She read slowly, sounding out the words like treasures themselves. The handwriting was clumsy at first, the way any child might write, but it grew steadier as the pages turned, the letters standing straighter and the thoughts becoming more confident. She discovered stories of small adventures, chasing birds across fields, building forts out of sticks and stones, drawing maps of the yard as though it were uncharted territory. The writer spoke of dreams of sailing across oceans, of climbing mountains, of discovering places no one had ever seen. And then there were the quieter parts, the pieces that tugged at her heart. Notes about loneliness, about days when there were no friends to play with, about hiding away from the world in this very secret room. She read confessions written with such raw honesty that it felt as if the writer had trusted the notebook more than any person. "I feel safe here," one page read, the pencil pressed harder than usual, the letters almost carved into the paper. "This is my place." She paused on those words for a long time, her small fingers stroking the indentations, feeling the weight of their truth. She knew that same feeling now, for the hidden room had become her place too. As she turned another page, she saw a drawing that startled her. It was a sketch of the house, recognizable even through the childish lines with its tall windows and heavy roof. But what struck her most was that the drawing showed a hidden section, a room marked with a star in one corner, exactly where she sat at that very moment. A shiver ran through her. The child who had written this had not only dreamed of secret places, they had drawn them, marked them as though preserving their existence. It was proof that this room had been used and cherished long before she had found it. The suspicion that had first flickered in her mind grew stronger with each page. Her grandmother's stories of her grandfather returned to her. He had been the kind of boy to invent, to hide, to create spaces of his own. He had loved this house, built things into it with his own hands, left behind details no one else noticed. Could it be that this notebook belonged to him, not as the man her grandmother remembered, but as a child who once roamed these same halls? The possibility made her chest tighten with wonder. She felt as though she were sitting face to face with him, not the grandfather she had never met, but the boy he had once been, his voice carried to her across the years through faded pencil marks. She read on, her eyes wide, her lips moving silently over the words. There were lists of wishes, simple ones, like having a dog or planting a tree that would grow taller than the house. There were dreams of traveling to London to see the tall buildings, or of flying in an airplane to cross the sea. Some of the pages were filled with nonsense words and doodles, the kind of playful rambling that spoke more loudly than serious sentences. Yet even those carried his spirit, a spirit restless and full of hope. She could feel him in every page, as though he had written not just for himself, but for someone like her to find one day. The thought overwhelmed her. Her eyes burned, though she was not sure why. She hugged the notebook to her chest, pressing it against her small heart, and closed her eyes. She imagined him there with her, sitting cross-legged on the same rug, his pencil scratching across the pages while the house creaked gently around him. She imagined him smiling when he thought of new ideas, frowning when the words would not come out right, sighing when he felt lonely and hidden. She had never known him in life, but here, in this room, she knew him more intimately than she could have believed possible. She whispered softly, though there was no one to hear. The room felt charged, as though the dust itself listened. It was not frightening. It was comforting, as though the walls welcomed her recognition. The house had always seemed alive to her, but now she knew why. It carried within it the echoes of her grandfather's childhood, his laughter, his frustrations, his dreams. They had soaked into the wood and the dust, waiting for her to uncover them. The connection deepened when she found the last pages of the notebook. They were more reflective, the words heavier, as if the writer had grown older in their lines. He wrote about how time was passing, how he might one day leave the house behind, but how he wanted a part of himself to remain. "If anyone finds this," the last note read, "then you will know me. Even if I am gone, I am here." The girl's breath caught. It was as if the message had been written directly to her, across decades, through time itself. She read the words again and again until they blurred, her small fingers trembling against the page. She sat in silence, the notebook resting in her lap, and felt the tears slip down her cheeks without understanding fully why. They were not tears of sadness alone, but of something larger, a recognition that she was not as small as she sometimes felt. She was part of a story that had begun long before her, one that would continue long after. She belonged to this house, to this family, to this legacy of imagination and secrets. Her grandfather's voice had reached her, and she had listened. When she finally left the hidden room, she carried the notebook pressed against her chest as though it were a sacred relic. She slipped back into her bedroom, closing the panel carefully behind her, and sat on her bed with the book in her lap. The familiar room looked different now. Every wall seemed to hum with memory. Every piece of furniture felt touched by the past. She could almost hear him, the boy her grandfather once was, whispering from somewhere close, urging her to keep the secret safe. That night, she did not hide the notebook away. She placed it beneath her pillow, its presence steady and reassuring as she drifted to sleep. In her dreams, she walked hand in hand with the boy who had written it, exploring fields and forests, drawing maps of imaginary lands, laughing at the silly doodles he left behind. And when she woke, she knew that the hidden room was no longer just a secret place. It was a bridge across time, a voice carried through pages, a gift from her ancestors meant for her alone. She would return again, she promised herself. She would keep reading, keep learning, Keep listening. The voice of her grandfather as a child had found her, and she would not let it fade. It was her duty now, her joy, and her treasure. The notebook remained beneath her pillow for many nights after she first carried it out of the hidden room, and though she did not always open it, its presence became a kind of comfort she could not part with. It was not simply a book of words anymore. It was a connection, a voice that reached out to her across time and told her she was not alone. Each morning when she woke, she would touch its worn cover before she rose from bed as though greeting an old friend. Each night she whispered goodnight to it in her thoughts, the way she might to a doll or a toy she loved. Yet, even as she held it close, she knew that its true place was within the hidden chamber, surrounded by the other treasures of memory. The room was not hers to take away from, it was hers to guard. Her secret grew heavier with time, not as a burden, but as a responsibility. When she played with her toys on the rug, she often glanced at the wall where the panel lay concealed, her eyes filled with a private knowledge that no one else shared. Her mother might walk past carrying laundry, her father might step in to kiss her forehead, her grandmother might pause in the doorway to smile, but none of them knew. The girl carried the weight of the secret alone, and it made her feel older somehow, more capable, as though she had been entrusted with something important that no one else could understand. She began to visit the hidden room more frequently, slipping through the panel whenever she could steal a moment of solitude. Each time she entered, she brushed the dust from the floor and arranged the objects more carefully, as though curating an exhibit. The doll sat propped against the chest, its button eyes watching over the chamber. The wooden figure stood beside it, arms outstretched in silent greeting. The marbles gleamed faintly in the pouch, waiting for a hand to scatter them again, and at the center, always, was the notebook, its pages now smudged slightly with her own fingerprints, its cover softened by her touch. But she was not content merely to read and observe. The longer she spent in the room, the stronger the urge grew to add something of her own, to continue the thread that had been left for her. She brought crayons and paper, folding them into neat stacks and tucking them alongside the old drawings she had found. She drew pictures of her family, of herself standing proudly with a smile as wide as the page, of the house with its tall roof and secret heart. She drew trees and birds, and the marbles she loved to roll across the floor, capturing her world the way the child before her had captured theirs. She left these drawings in the chest, knowing that they too would one day belong to the memory of this place. Soon she began to write as well. Her letters were crooked, her spelling uncertain, but her heart was full. She wrote about her dreams, about wanting to be an artist, about wanting to see the sea with her own eyes. She wrote about her grandmother's stories, about the meals her mother cooked, about the times her father lifted her into his arms and made her laugh until her stomach hurt. She wrote about loneliness, too, about moments when she felt small, but also about the comfort she found in this room. "This is my place," she copied from the page she had read in the notebook, but she added beneath it in her own uneven hand, "It is ours." The act of writing made her feel as though she were speaking directly to the child who had come before her, answering across the years. With every visit, the hidden room became less a relic of the past and more a living space of her own. The dust still gathered in the corners, the air still smelled faintly of age, but it was no longer a place of silence. It was filled with her laughter, her whispers, the scratch of her crayons, the sound of paper rustling beneath her fingers. It was a secret, shared between her and the boy she believed her grandfather had once been. a dialogue written not in speech, but in the exchange of dreams. As weeks passed, she noticed that she no longer feared being alone. The dark corridors of the house, the strange creaks of the floorboards, the sigh of the wind through the trees, all of these seemed friendlier now, as though the house itself recognized her as its keeper. The shadows did not frighten her. Instead, they seemed to beckon her, reminding her that even in darkness there could be discovery. She carried herself differently, with a quiet pride, as though she had inherited more than just a house. She had inherited a story, and she was now its next chapter. One evening, after she had spent hours arranging her newest drawings in the chest, she sat on the rug in the hidden room and closed her eyes. She tried to imagine what the future would hold, who might one day find these things after her. Perhaps it would be her own child, or her grandchild, or another little girl or boy who lived in the house long after she had grown. The thought filled her with a kind of peace. She was no longer only a discoverer of secrets. She was a keeper of them, a guardian of memory. She would pass it on, just as it had been passed to her. She returned to her bedroom quietly, closing the panel with the gentle care of someone tucking away a beloved treasure. She climbed into bed and pulled the blanket to her chin, but her mind was far from sleep. She thought of the boy who had written the notebook, of how he must have felt sitting alone in the chamber, never knowing that his words would find her decades later. She wished she could thank him, could tell him how much his stories meant, how they made her feel less alone, and then she realized that, in a way, she already had. Every page she added, every drawing she left behind was her answer, her gratitude written in the language of childhood. As she drifted off, she understood something she had never considered before. Childhood itself was a kind of treasure, fleeting and precious, and this hidden room was a vault that kept it safe. Her grandfather's childhood still lived there in the chest, and now her own joined it, layered together like the pages of a book. One day, she would outgrow the games, the crayons, the secret hiding places. But this room would remain, holding the echoes of who she had been, waiting for another child to listen. The girl slept with a smile, knowing she was no longer just a child playing at adventure. She was the new keeper of the hidden room, the guardian of its memory, and in her care the treasure would live on. The house, with all its creaks and sighs, seemed to agree, settling around her with a warmth that lulled her deeper into dreams. Somewhere in the quiet, she thought she heard the faintest sound, a whisper not of fear but of approval, as though the boy she had come to know across the pages had given her his blessing. She carried that whisper with her into sleep, and she knew she would carry it always, a secret voice guiding her forward into the life that awaited her. Don't miss more incredible stories like this one. Hit subscribe now and turn on the bell so you never miss what comes next. Check out our other videos for more hidden secrets and amazing discoveries. And share this video with your friends so they can join the adventure too.